Hare Krishna, everyone. This is the acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm taking a question from one of my viewers that I thought would make for a good video to present on my Bhakti page. So this question goes like this. Could you speak to the distinction between the spiritual paths of ascent versus descent as they are conceptualized in the Bhakti tradition? Context for the question. By ascent, I'm referring to the path of spirit realization through which we surrender the attachment to individuality, transcending both ego and soul identification, and ultimately seeing beyond the illusion of a separate self. The ascent may be understood as a more solar process and is often engaged via practices such as meditation, prayer, and contemplation. Often the teachings of religious institutions, those at least with a more mystical impulse, and transcendental schools aim to assist along the ascensional path. Well, that's really clear and really nice writing. By descent, I am referring to the path of underworld soul embodiment, by which individuality is deepened and the individual soul comes to understand and enact its particular place and form of service in the world. This more lunar process may be facilitated by practices such as dream work and deep imagery journeys, ceremonies and rituals, and intentional communion with the more than human natural world. Such practices, while absent in much of both Western and Eastern spiritual traditions, are commonplace among nature-based indigenous peoples, and their value has been explored at length by the depth psychology movement and by thinkers such as Jung and Hillman. Another really nice definition. So now we have ascent versus descent. Behind the ascent-descent distinction, then, is a question of the spirit-soul polarity. Both spirit and soul are ultimately transpersonal terms. But we think of spirit as referring to the mystery of the one, of the light, of the great unity underlying and sustaining all being. By contrast, soul points to the mystery of the unique and the infinitely diverse, of the underworld and depth of dark and of death. In relation to spirit, we all have the same lesson to learn, but in relationship to soul, the lessons and qualities are profoundly unique. Although different, the goals and processes of soul embodiment and spirit realization are fully compatible and complementary. We can deepen our individuality and its expression, while at the same time surrendering our identification with that individuality. Each process facilitates the other, and a truly embodied soul is freed to exist as an agent for spirit. Beautiful, really nice synthesis too. As an extension of the original question, Achyuta, I wondered if you might speak to your experience of ayahuasca shamanism, which I envision as primarily a path of spiritual descent in relationship to your practice of bhakti. Do you feel that your ayahuasca journey prepared you for the overall more ascensional path of bhakti? Or would you say that bhakti equally acknowledges the necessity of and delineates paths for both the ascent and the descent? Wow, what a great question. I was honestly thrilled to read this because it's just such a nice and intelligent and well-written and really thoughtful question. So I'll do my best to answer. First of all, I want to push back a little on two things. One, that ayahuasca is descent-oriented and bhakti is ascent-oriented. I'm going to say that actually both ayahuasca and bhakti are both, and I'll try to explain why. And especially focusing on bhakti and how we can understand bhakti as a path of ascension and descension, to use these words. But first I want to push back on the idea that Western and Eastern spiritual traditions are bereft of the descent and that indigenous people are somehow the sole, let's say, owners or explorers of descent in spiritual terms. Actually, if you think about Christianity has, although there are some more punitive like strains of Christian theology that really condemn the body, condemn the world, and focus purely on transcendence and heaven and so forth. Actually, if we read very carefully the story of Jesus, there are many elements of descent imbued within the gospel stories. For example, Jesus' birth takes place under secrecy, fear of murder, in a lowly manger, with wise men from the east following a star. It's pretty mysterious and magical, and there's prophecy and cross-cultural mystical diviners traveling to follow a star. Also, of course, in Jesus's life, there are scenes that suggest a depth to the person of Jesus. For example, when John the Baptist was beheaded, Jesus took off into a rowboat and wept by himself out on the waters. this solitary picture of God. This is the embodiment of God, of Son of God in this Christian story, right? The embodied enlightened soul is weeping over the death of a friend in isolation on the water. This is such a rich image. Also, if you think about Jesus in Gethsemane, the fear, sweating blood, basically, right, and asking if this cup can be passed. There's real fear of death. It's the dark night of the soul. There's torture and cruelty, and there's betrayal. There's suicide. There's real depth and complexity in the way that the death and crucifixion play out. And the symbolism, of course, of the communion is that of the body being broken open. And this is God. So this is God's body being broken open. And in that, the alchemy, the alchemical picture that's there, if we're paying attention, and many Christian contemplative mystics have, is that of the descent of pain and of ensouled, experience, that God comes in and sanctifies the suffering, and that the suffering is a necessary ingredient. It's the alchemical nigredo that's necessary for resurrection. We can't just skip over it, and it's not just that this is in service of that. The two are they exist in a relationship, in a sacred and holy, mysterious relationship. So I think that I would venture to say true Christianity is a path of both ascent and descent simultaneously, as are mystical elements of Islam. For example, look at what the Sufis do and look at what their beliefs are. Similarly, in Buddhism, I think arguably there are many aspects of descent, and there are demons and gods and so forth. And same thing in yoga. I mean, yoga, the Hindu pantheon and the stories of descent and ascent simultaneously are there in yoga philosophy as well. It's so why is it that we get this? And then in the opposite direction, let me flip this over for a second, because I've obviously 10 years experience with South American shamanism and the indigenous healers that I met there. There are brews of ayahuasca, one called cielo ayahuasca, for example, that is called sky ayahuasca, or heavens ayahuasca, and it's a brew that's specifically made for the purpose of ascent. Whereas there are other brews that are more intentionally about descent. There are different plants that are about descent, and there are plant spirits that are about ascent. The shamanic tradition itself, if you look at the artwork, ayahuasca artwork in South America is filled with images of ethereal, almost like space realms and even UFOs, while also being really rich with animal earth iconography. So, and the same thing can be true for many Native American cultures all around the planet. Mircea Eliade wrote this famous book on shamanism where he talked about the image of the ladder moving into the sky in a vertical path. And Black Elk Speaks, another great book on shamanism, another Native American elder. And that path is filled with the vertical and the ascensional path, the great spirit that all pervading, as well as the descent. So there might be something of a false dichotomy there. And I just wanted to, just push back kind of lightly against that. But on the other hand, I want to push back on the idea that ayahuasca is descensional and that bhakti is ascensional. So ayahuasca is very much ascensional in the sense that one of the primary things that it does is it liberates the soul from its entanglement with the limiting view of nescience in materiality. You see, I'm not the body. I'm a spirit soul. There are other spirit souls. They're indwelling in nature. There are other realms. And it's not that you see one at the cost of the other. It's that you see that they're co-present. Ayahuasca helps you understand that there's just more than what you're seeing. Similarly, like, Plato's allegory of the cave, it's not that the shadows aren't real. It's just that they're not all that's real. So I think sometimes ascent and descent get polarized when they're not really polarized at all. They're different ways of experiencing divinity. There are different ways of experiencing self. There are different ways of experiencing other. And like you said, they're complementary, right? So in ayahuasca speak, one of the main things that ayahuasca does is kind of make you aware of the fact that there is more than meets the eye, and that there is more than just the material, the literal, the concrete of matter. That's maybe one of the first most basic things it does. And so to say that Native people are living in a more decent kind of earthbound consciousness is, not that you were saying that exactly, but it's not really the case, because transcendence is also transcendence is so basic that it becomes mundane in shamanic consciousness. Ladders to the sky are normal, you know what I mean? And that's in a sense just as earthy as, serpents or mud. So all of that is just to kind of try to push back on that too with ayahuasca, because ayahuasca will take you very deep into the soul and the soul's history and the particulars and the individual suffering and depth and so forth. But it does so as it is also illuminating the realms of consciousness that are co-present with, but also more expansive than the limited material view that we often have when we're just sort of sleepwalking through life, thinking about our appetites and the immediate, material dramas unfolding around us. So ayahuasca does both, and it has a rich history, even in the iconography, of displaying both ends of that spectrum. And so Bhakti is very similar, and this is where I'll focus for the rest of my little talk here. Bhakti is rooted in a metaphysical reality called acyuta-bhava tattva, which you've probably heard me say before if you listen to my Bhakti channel. That means inconceivable, simultaneous oneness and difference. So the conception of us as individual souls in relation to God is not one of like, God's way up there, and I'm somehow separate and fallen, and I have, and then maybe there's a view of like having to, that this is just an illusion, that I'm actually God, and then I have to eliminate that feeling of being a separate self. For example, in your ascent piece, you said, I'm referring to the path of spirit realization through which we surrender the attachment to individuality, transcending both ego and soul identification, and ultimately seeing beyond the illusion of a separate self. In Bhakti, there's just no such thing. In Bhakti, acyuta-bhava tattva means that we are as spiritual entities, without origin, beginning, or we have no beginning and we have no end. We're eternal beings, and we are of the same substance of God, but we're also ontologically, fundamentally unique as a category of being, but also as individual beings. So as souls, as spirit souls, you are entirely unique. There is no one else like you. Not even God is like you. Right? But then there is also a sense in which your essence is the exact same as God, like a spark is to the fire. The spark is the exact same substance of the fire. It could start a fire, but it's also not the fire. So similarly, the rays of sun that come in through the window, they are not the sun itself, which is massive, and if you touch it, you'll burn up, right? But the sun beams are still a part of the sun, or an aspect of the sun. So there is this way in which, yes, there's this all-pervasive, unified spirit of God. Everything is God and nothing is not God, right? So everything is divine. But there's variegation, and every particle of manifest duality, meaning anything other than God that is made in the image of God, that's an emanation of God, like spark to a fire, is utterly and completely unique. And that agency, that autonomy, cannot, and the goal is definitely not to ever try to reduce or eliminate that individuality. So in Bhakti, this is quite different from impersonal or monistic paths of, there's different Eastern philosophies, different religious paths in the world that will emphasize that the idea that you're an individual soul is an illusion, and that you're just a part of God, and the idea is to transcend, the feeling of being different or separate, and to merge back into the total oneness. In Bhakti, this is not the case. We say that what the goal of Bhakti is to deepen and intensify the absolutely unique and infinitely personal relationship that each soul has to God. Not God as a diffuse white light, but God as a person, God as a being, God is an actual personal being with a form. And that's also, and of course, not just one form, right? But the form that God appears to us in and speaks to us through is a part of the uniqueness of our soul and our soul's unique relationship with God. And so the process of bhakti with chanting, praying, dancing, singing, food, care of the altar, it's all about incorporating, bringing in the variegatedness of creation into the relationship, the personal relationship with God, which serves to deepen, complexify, intensify the particularity of the soul. In fact, what bhakti is doing is helping us eventually to awaken to our own swarup, which is like our own essential spiritual form. And that form can't be, it can't be understood. The thing that reveals our true individuality is relationship with our source, with God. So in that sense, bhakti is very much an ensouling, descensional, like descent process. And in fact, the greatest, the God is depicted in the bhakti yoga tradition as Krishna and Radha, and that is the God as God and beloved. And so that in a sense, the two are totally separate, but they're also part of the same thing. And what makes love possible and what makes the potential for love to be an infinitely unfolding process is that there is no time at which the two can absolutely be one without maintaining some degree of separateness. And so the separateness that feels like a curse, the separateness that feels like isolation, that feels like abandonment, that feels like getting kicked out of the garden, that feels like the loneliness, the dark night of the soul, all of the things that you mentioned in terms of the descensional path, moving down into embodied sort of particularity and the suffering of being an individual, alone and apart from the beloved, that without that, we don't have love. So that one of the highest states of love in bhakti is called love in separation, which means that separation is what the gap between self and other, self and God, is what allows for the potential for love to be freely chosen, reciprocated, and exchanged between individual souls and their source and God. So that pain and the distance and the separation is part of what facilitates the ongoing journey of intimacy that's so deeply personalizing. And we can't do away with that. However, paradoxically, at the same time, the more that our relationship with God intensifies and deepens and particularizes, the more that we also start to transcend more limited understandings of ourselves, of others, of the world, of the cosmos, of God, and yet both the sense of separation and pulling back to self and the continued unfolding of ourselves, as well as the continued transcending understanding of ourselves and reality is perpetually happening. There's no end to it. So it's in that way, it's like a dance or a leela, a play, or a lover's union, imagined as a lover's union in the highest levels, that it can't exhaust itself. You don't want to merge, right? Because if you merge, then the potential for ongoing, expansion and deepening of love is gone. So in bhakti, it's never the goal to eliminate the individual soul into God. The separation is considered holy. I hope that answers the question. I know that I kind of had to just start rolling with it to explain it to the best of my ability. Not that I have any of this realization, but I think of it a lot like a romantic relationship. And there's a phrase in C.S. Lewis's book, The Last Battle, which was the last of the Narnia Chronicles, which was rooted in the symbolism of Saturn, the planet. And he has a chapter where he's talking about how the children end up experiencing heaven. And it's called Further Up, Further In. So as transcendence occurs, there's a way in which as it's expanding, it is also particularizing. And think about it like this in a lover's relationship. When you reach new platforms of intimacy, there is a sense in which the new intensification of your love is transcendent to anything you've ever experienced before, and it feels that way. It feels that way. However, it is rooted in and cannot be separated in the pain, the suffering, and the sense of the two people being irreconcilably different. And romance, in that sense, is always burning with a kind of pain. And the more that we learn to appreciate that, the more that it becomes the secret, keyhole through which deeper love is realized. So in Bhakti, transcendence and immanence, the ascent and the descent are always in a dance with one another. And you see this repeated, I think, in many other traditions. So I think that the dichotomy of these two is usually feel them polarized when a practitioner of any tradition perhaps has not, they're not individuating so much yet within their spiritual path. It's as though the more we individuate within any kind of spiritual discipline or path, the more that these two sides of spiritual life start to coalesce. They come together and mingle really closely with one another, and you become familiar and able to talk about both of them simultaneously. And a good teacher of any spiritual path, whether it's seems more shamanic, or it seems more like one of the great religious historical religious traditions, whether it seems more pagan or it seems more institutional or whatever, you'll notice that anyone who seems like a lamp that can light the path for you is able to speak without making you feel like either of those sides of spiritual life are excluded. And it's something you feel in the way that they speak, or it just shines through in their expression and in the way they live their life. So, but yeah, in Bhakti, there's a lot more that could be said about this. And certainly if any of my Vaishnav Bhakti friends are listening to this, and you would like to elaborate upon any of these thoughts, or, please feel free to correct me or help me understand how to explain it better too, because I'm really, really a novice. So at any rate, hopefully this was helpful. What a great question. Thank you for it. And I hope that all of you who listened to this enjoyed it. If you have any questions you ever like to email me, or follow-ups to this one, info@nightlightastrology.com. I'd be happy to field your questions. And I look forward to talking again soon. Hare Krishna.